There is a specific kind of quiet that roars louder than any spoken word. A silence so dense it physically weighs on your chest during those late-night hours when sleep refuses to come. It is the hollow stillness that remains after a man exits your life, leaving behind no messages, no phone calls, and not even a single fragment of attention to hold on to. Despite the void, a persistent whisper deep within your soul insists that the story is far from over. You find yourself confused because he is behaving as if your shared history never occurred. I want you to consider a challenging question. What if this silence is not a form of closure, but a calculated strategy? What if his total withdrawal has nothing to do with finding peace, and everything to do with maintaining power, ego, and a hidden obsession? What if he is using indifference as a mask because, in reality, silence is never truly vacant? It is actually saturated with specific intent. And tonight, we are going to dismantle the illusion together. We are going to decipher the messages he is trying to hide within his quietness. Once this truth takes root in your mind, you will stop waiting for emotional scraps and refuse to negotiate your value ever again. You will no longer feel diminished by the stillness, because his silence isn't a sign that he has moved on. It is a sign that he is betting on you losing sight of your own power. That cycle stops today. I want you to reflect on the exact moment the tide began to turn. When his responses became brief, the affection started to evaporate, and the initial spark began to fade into a cold distance. It didn't vanish all at once. It faded, like watching a sunset slowly lose its color. Not enough to panic, just enough to ache. And then one day, the silence arrived. Maybe he disappeared without explanation. Maybe he said he needed space. Maybe he promised clarity that never came. And suddenly, you were left alone with questions. Your mind replaying every word, every laugh, every moment, as if the right combination of memories might unlock the truth. You wondered what you said wrong, what you should have said, what you should have been. And here's where most women lose themselves. Because when silence appears, the instinct is to fill it, to reach, to explain, to ask, to soften, to save. But listen carefully. A man's silence is rarely accidental. Silence is not absence. It is leverage. It is not confusion. It is calculation. And often it is not peace he is seeking. It is reassurance that he still matters, that he still controls the emotional temperature of the room. There is a reason this hurts so deeply, and it has nothing to do with weakness. You are responding exactly as a human heart responds. When connection is withdrawn without explanation, the psyche panics in uncertainty. And this is where psychology matters, because uncertainty creates attachment, not clarity. This is why intermittent attention feels addictive, why hot and cold behavior keeps you hooked, why silence becomes louder than love. And this is not coincidence. Carl Jung once said, "Where your fear is, there your task is." Your discomfort in the silence is not proof that you need him. It is proof that something inside you is being called to wake up. Here is the truth few people will tell you. Some men pull away not to leave, but to measure. They want to see how long it takes before you reach, how deeply their absence unsettles you, how easily your peace can be disturbed. Not because they are evil, but because their ego confuses being wanted with being valued. They were taught that love looks like pursuit, and silence is the bait. When he withdraws, a vacuum forms, and the human nervous system hates vacuums. You feel compelled to fill it, to restore balance, to reconnect. And every time you do, you teach him something. You teach him that silence works, that distance earns attention, that withdrawal brings reassurance. Even pain becomes proof of relevance. And this is why silence can be a weapon. not because it is loud, but because it forces the other person to speak, to explain, to chase, to bend. But there is another kind of silence, one he never anticipates. The silence that does not panic, the silence that does not chase, the silence that does not explain, the silence that arrives when a woman stops negotiating her worth. This silence does not ask questions, it answers them. It says, "My energy is not a bargaining chip. My presence is not guaranteed. My love is not something you can pause and resume at will." This is the silence that unsettles him. Because now, the power dynamic shifts. He expected anxiety. He expected pursuit. He expected emotional noise. But instead, he meets stillness. And stillness terrifies the ego. Because now, there is no reaction to feed from. No proof of control. No emotional mirror reflecting his importance. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." His silence is unconscious behavior, ego-driven, fear-based, and control-oriented. Your awakening makes it visible, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This is where obsession quietly begins, not because you disappear, but because you no longer respond the way he expects. Men do not always miss women. They miss how women made them feel about themselves. When you stop validating, stop reassuring, stop softening his edges, stop absorbing his emotional confusion, something inside him collapses because he was never prepared to sit with himself without your presence buffering his emptiness. He may not reach out, but he will watch. He will notice the absence, the lack of reaction, the calm where chaos used to be. And his silence begins to feel different. He used silence to control. Now silence reflects loss. This is not romance. This is psychology. This is the moment when a woman quietly reclaims herself, not with anger, not with speeches, not with ultimatums, but with dignity, with restraint, and with peace. And something subtle shifts inside her. She stops checking her phone compulsively. She stops decoding his behavior. She stops needing answers from someone who speaks through absence. And in that stillness, clarity arrives. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." This is that threshold where you stop waiting to be chosen and choose yourself. Not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. And while you are finding yourself again, he is losing access to your attention, your softness, and your emotional availability. And that loss, that quiet, irreversible loss, is what echoes in his mind, because the silence he created no longer bends in his favor. And for the first time, he realizes something he never expected to face. That silence in the hands of a woman who knows her worth is no longer a weapon. It is a boundary. And boundaries change everything. And once that boundary forms, something irreversible happens inside you. You stop romanticizing his silence. You stop translating absence into meaning. You stop assigning depth to behavior that lacks courage. Because clarity does not come from what he feels. It comes from what he does. And silence, when it replaces effort, is not mystery. It is information. This is where many women struggle, because the mind wants answers. But the soul already knows. You felt it when the energy shifted, when warmth turned conditional, when presence became optional. And yet you stayed, not because you were weak, but because you hoped consistency would return. If you loved harder, waited longer, or understood deeper. But love is not a test of endurance, and silence is not intimacy. Here is the part that stings, but sets you free. A man who values you does not make you guess. He does not disappear to feel powerful. He does not go quiet to see how much pain you will tolerate, Because secure love does not need silence to breathe. What you experienced was not depth. It was imbalance. And imbalance always demands payment from the one who cares more. This is why his silence felt personal. Why it reached into your chest. Why it followed you into sleep. Because inconsistency activates the deepest wound. The fear of abandonment. And when that wound is touched, the nervous system reacts, not the rational mind. So you blamed yourself. You softened your needs. You waited. But silence is not neutral. It either protects peace or avoids responsibility. And the silence you were given was not peaceful. It was heavy, strategic, and self-serving. There is a moment every woman reaches when she realizes she has been emotionally negotiating with someone who already left the table. That moment hurts, but it is sacred because it marks the end of self-betrayal. You begin to see that his silence was not confusion. It was comfort. Comfort in knowing you were still there, still hoping, still emotionally available. And when that comfort disappears, when you no longer rush to fill the space, when you no longer offer reassurance for distance, something changes. Not in him first, but in you. Your breathing slows. Your thoughts soften. Your nervous system stops bracing for impact. This is not indifference. This is healing. And healing is quiet. You start doing things without narrating them to him. You stop wondering if he would approve. You stop filtering your joy through his absence. You reclaim your center. Carl Jung said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." Silence is one of those avoidances. He avoided accountability, vulnerability, and emotional presence. And for a while, you carried the weight of that avoidance for him. But now, you put it down. And here is where the psychology flips. Because the moment you stop reacting, his silence loses its function. It no longer triggers reassurance. It no longer produces pursuit. It no longer feeds ego. And without feedback, control collapses. He may not reach out immediately. Sometimes he won't at all. But internally, something destabilizes because the dynamic he relied on no longer exists. This is when memories resurface for him. Not the arguments, not the tension, but the safety. The way you made him feel seen, grounded, and important. And without your emotional presence, those feelings have nowhere to land. This is not love awakening. This is loss registering. And loss often disguises itself as obsession. He checks, he wonders, he monitors from a distance, not because he suddenly understands you, but because the silence no longer bends toward him. And that unsettles the ego deeply, because ego depends on reflection. When you stop reflecting his importance, he is left alone with himself. This is why your silence now feels different, lighter, cleaner. It is not waiting. It is not hoping. It is choosing. And choice is power. You are no longer trying to be understood. You are understanding yourself. You are no longer asking why he changed. You are asking why you tolerated confusion. This is where the real transformation happens. Because you stop interpreting his silence and start interpreting your response to it. You notice how much energy you once spent trying to maintain connection, trying to be patient, trying to be enough. And you feel grief not just for him, but for yourself. For the nights you waited, the words you swallowed, and the needs you minimized. And you forgive yourself because you were loving, not foolish. And loving deeply in a shallow environment always hurts. But it also awakens strength. Your silence now is not a tactic. It is alignment. It aligns your actions with your worth, your energy with your values, your presence with reciprocity. And whether he ever returns becomes irrelevant, because something more important has happened. you have returned to yourself. And once that happens, the game ends. Not because you won, but because you no longer play. Your silence is no longer a message to him. It is a commitment to you. And that is the kind of quiet that changes everything. And when you return to yourself, you begin to see things with a clarity that once felt impossible. You notice how quiet your life becomes. Not empty, but spacious. There is room to breathe, room to feel without panic, room to exist without constantly waiting for someone else to decide your worth. This is where many women mistake peace for numbness because they were conditioned to believe intensity equals connection, that anxiety equals passion, that uncertainty equals depth. But real depth does not destabilize you. It anchors you. And what you had was not anchoring. It was drifting. Now let's speak about what happens inside him. Not to glorify it, not to center him, but to dissolve the illusion that his silence meant you were forgotten. Because forgetting requires closure, and silence rarely gives that when a man leaves without resolution, without honesty, and without emotional accountability. His mind does not settle. It loops. Unfinished emotional business lingers, not romantically, but psychologically. This is why he remembers you in fragments. Your laugh, your patience, the way you understood him without demanding much. And now those memories return, without your presence to soften them. This is where obsession quietly forms. Not obsession with you, but with the loss of emotional safety you provided, because you were the place his ego rested. The space where he did not have to be fully accountable, the mirror that reflected his value without demanding growth. And when that mirror disappears, he feels exposed. This is why silence works differently when reversed. Your silence does not chase. It does not provoke. It does not perform. It simply exists. And that existence unsettles him, because for the first time, he has no role to play. No leverage to pull, no emotional thread to tug. He may tell himself he moved on, but movement without integration always circles back. Not outwardly, but inwardly. This is why some men resurface months later with vague messages, nostalgia, curiosity masked as concern. They are not returning to love. They are checking if the door is still unlocked. And here is where your growth matters. Because when a woman has not healed, she mistakes reappearance for meaning. But when she has, she recognizes it as testing. Testing whether access still exists. Testing whether silence still works. Testing whether she will fold. And this is where dignity speaks louder than words ever could. Not through cruelty, not through lectures, but through consistency. Your consistency with yourself. You no longer over-explain. You no longer justify boundaries. You no longer perform emotional labor for someone who chose distance. And something profound happens. His silence loses narrative power. It no longer defines the story. It no longer shapes your self-perception. It no longer dictates your emotional rhythm. You stop asking why and start asking, what does this teach me about myself? And the answer is always the same. You were capable of loving deeply, and now you are capable of choosing wisely. Carl Jung said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." You were transformed not by his presence, but by his absence. And that transformation did not harden you. It refined you. You became more discerning, more grounded, more aligned with your own emotional truth. This is why your silence is different now. It is not avoidance. It is discernment. It is the difference between closing a door in anger and simply not reopening it. And this is what haunts the ego. Because ego thrives on unfinished access, on emotional loopholes, and on knowing it can return without consequence. But when it meets a woman who no longer lives in emotional limbo, who no longer waits in potential, who no longer pauses her life for inconsistency. It collapses, not dramatically, quietly. And collapse is always silent. This is where people misunderstand obsession. They think obsession is pursuit, messages, and grand gestures. But obsession often looks like restraint, watching, monitoring, thinking, and remembering. Especially when pride blocks vulnerability. He may never tell you, but there is a moment he realizes you are not coming back the same. And that realization arrives in silence, when your name is mentioned, and nothing stirs in you. When he checks and sees you living, not proving, not signaling, just being. When mutual spaces no longer feel charged because your energy is no longer tethered to his reaction. This is where power truly shifts. Because power was never about control. It was about freedom. And freedom always belongs to the one who can walk away without explanation. Not because they are cold, but because they are complete. This is where your silence becomes sacred. It protects your nervous system, your clarity, and your future. It filters out people who only show up when they feel uncertain, and makes room for those who choose presence without games. And whether he ever understands this is irrelevant, because your healing does not require his awareness. Your peace does not require his regret. Your worth does not require his recognition. And this is the moment you stop narrating the past and start inhabiting the present. You no longer frame your growth as a response to his absence. It simply becomes your life. And in that life, there is less intensity, but more depth. Less chaos, but more truth. Less waiting, but more alignment. This is the quiet power of a woman who has learned that silence is not something to fear. It is something to choose. And when chosen from self-respect, it becomes the most honest language you will ever speak. There is a subtle moment that arrives after the noise fades, after the questions stop circling, after your body no longer braces for the sound of his name. It is the moment you realize you are no longer reacting. You are responding to life itself. This is where the real shift settles in, because silence is no longer something that happened to you. It becomes something you inhabit. And this kind of silence is not hollow. It is full. Full of intuition returning. Full of self-trust rebuilding. Full of emotional authority. You begin to notice how your thoughts change. How you no longer frame your days around his absence. How your mood no longer rises and falls with imagined outcomes. You stop asking what he's thinking and start listening to what you feel. And what you feel is relief. Not because the story ended cleanly, but because you finally stopped bleeding into it. This is where many women misunderstand strength. They think strength is coldness, detachment, or armor. But true strength is softness with boundaries, openness without self-erasure, love without self-abandonment. Your silence now holds that balance. It is not punishment. It is protection. And protection is the language of self-respect. This is also the point where guilt tries to creep in. You may hear the old voice whisper, "Maybe you're being too distant. Maybe you should be kinder. Maybe he didn't mean to hurt you." But compassion without reciprocity becomes self-betrayal, and you have done that enough. You are not cruel for choosing clarity. You are not heartless for refusing confusion. You are not selfish for stepping out of emotional chaos. You are aligned, and alignment is calm. This is why your presence feels different now, why people respond to you differently, why conversations feel cleaner, why attraction shifts. Because energy always follows self-respect. And even if he never says it, even if he never reaches out again, something inside him recognizes the shift. Not consciously, but instinctively, Because when someone removes emotional access, without bitterness, without drama, and without explanation, it triggers something primal. It forces reflection, and reflection is uncomfortable. Especially for someone who relied on distance to avoid emotional accountability. He may rationalize. He may distract himself. He may convince himself you were never that important. But unresolved attachment does not disappear. It waits, not for reconciliation, but for recognition. And recognition only comes when the ego cracks. This is why your silence unsettles him more than confrontation ever could. Anger would have kept you emotionally available. Tears would have reassured him of impact. Long messages would have kept the door ajar. But quiet dignity offers no handle to grab. And without a handle, control dissolves. Carl Jung once said, "What you resist persists." You stopped resisting his silence. You stopped fighting it. You stopped needing to understand it, and in doing so, you disarmed it. You allowed it to exist without giving it meaning, and meaning is where attachment lives. This is why your healing accelerated the moment you stopped asking why. Because why keeps you tethered, while what now moves you forward. You start asking different questions. What kind of love feels safe in my body? What kind of presence calms me instead of excites my anxiety? What kind of connection does not require performance? And these questions change your future. Because you no longer confuse intensity with intimacy, or distance with depth. You begin to crave steadiness, consistency, and emotional availability. Things that once felt boring now feel nourishing. And this is when the old dynamic fully collapses. Because even if he returned, even if he apologized, even if he tried to explain, you would hear it differently. Not from longing, but from discernment. Not from hope, but from clarity. You would feel the mismatch immediately. And this is the quiet truth many men sense but cannot articulate. They know on some level that the woman they left is not the woman they could return to. Because silence changed her. Not by hardening her, but by revealing her limits. And limits are terrifying to someone who benefited from your lack of them. This is why some never reach out again, not because they don't care, but because they feel the distance is no longer safe to cross, because crossing it would require humility, accountability, and emotional maturity. Things silence forced them to confront, but not necessarily develop. And that is not your burden. Your responsibility ended the moment you stopped trying to be understood by someone who communicated through absence. You did not fail to love. You loved fully. You simply stopped overextending into a space that could not hold you. This is not loss. This is completion. Not of the relationship, but of the lesson. And once a lesson integrates, it no longer needs to repeat. Your nervous system learns. Your intuition sharpens, your boundaries solidify, and you carry this wisdom forward, not as armor, but as awareness. You no longer chase clarity. You require it. You no longer tolerate silence that confuses. You choose silence that protects. You understand now that peace is not passive. It is chosen, and chosen peace is powerful because it does not beg. It does not prove, it does not wait. It moves on, quietly, confidently, without looking back. And in that movement, something final occurs. The story releases you. Not with a dramatic ending, but with a sense of rightness. You do not need his regret. You do not need his explanation. You do not need his return because the version of you who needed that no longer exists. And the version of you who remains is rooted, self-trusting, and whole. This is the woman silence revealed. Not because silence was kind, but because you were brave enough to listen to what it was teaching you. And once you learn that lesson, you carry it forward into relationships that feel mutual, into conversations that feel present, into love that does not disappear. When it gets real, this is where your story continues. Not loudly, not urgently, but truthfully. And nothing, not even silence, has power over you anymore. There comes a point when silence is no longer something you endure. It becomes something you understand. And understanding changes everything. Because once you truly understand silence, you stop personalizing it. You stop chasing meaning inside it. You stop allowing it to define you. You see it for what it always was, a reflection of him, not a verdict on you. This is where the final shift occurs. You no longer ask, "Did I matter?" You ask, "Why did I ever doubt that I did?" And that question doesn't carry pain. It carries power. Because pain asks for answers. Power creates direction. You start to recognize how much of your emotional energy was spent trying to be chosen, trying to be understood, trying to be prioritized. And you realize something quietly devastating and quietly liberating. Real love never requires that effort. It requires presence, consistency, and courage. Things silence cannot provide. This is why closure never came from him. It was never meant to. Closure was never a conversation. It was a decision. The decision to stop waiting. The decision to stop interpreting breadcrumbs. The decision to stop handing your worth to someone who handled it carelessly. And once that decision settles in your body, your posture changes, your voice steadies, your gaze sharpens. You are no longer asking life, "Am I enough?" You are asking, "Does this align with who I am becoming?" And alignment is ruthless, but kind. It removes what no longer fits without explanation, without apology. This is why your silence now feels clean, not heavy. It doesn't ache. It doesn't beg. It doesn't wonder. It simply is. And that is the silence he never learned how to use. Because he used silence to avoid, while you learned to use it to choose. That difference matters. You see, some people disappear to escape discomfort. Others grow still to integrate truth. You integrated, and integration changes your standards. Not because you became harder, but because you became clearer. You now recognize the difference between emotional depth and emotional unavailability, between mystery and avoidance, between privacy and secrecy. And once you see those distinctions, you cannot unsee them. This is why the past no longer pulls you. It informs you. It sharpens your intuition instead of hijacking it. This is where your power becomes unmistakable. Because you no longer need validation to trust your experience. You know what you felt. You know what you gave. You know what you deserved. And you no longer need him to confirm any of it. This is what freedom actually looks like. Not indifference, not bitterness, but emotional sovereignty. The ability to stay open without being porous. To love without losing yourself. This is where many people never arrive, because it requires sitting with silence long enough to hear your own voice again. And you did. You stayed. You listened. You learned. And that learning rewired you. Carl Jung said, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another." There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. You stopped trying to make yourself fit someone who could not meet you where you stood. You stopped shrinking your needs to preserve connection. You stopped mistaking patience for compatibility. And in doing so, you honored your individuality. This is why your future relationships will feel different. They will feel quieter, but safer. Less dramatic, but more real. Less intoxicating, but more nourishing. Because you are no longer attracted to emotional volatility. You are attracted to emotional availability, and that changes everything. This is also why, if he ever thinks of you now, it will not be with triumph. It will be with a sense of something missed, not because you were perfect, but because you were present. And presence is rare, especially in a world where people hide behind distance, distraction, and silence. He might never find the words to confess it, but the version of you that chose to exit with quiet dignity will forever remain an unresolved mystery in his mind. Not necessarily as a romantic longing, but as a profound lesson he was too cowardly to learn. You must realize that his inability to grow is not your burden to carry. Your only true responsibility is the reality you are constructing right now. A life where silence is a peaceful choice you make, not a punishment forced upon you. You are building a world where love is articulated with transparency or not at all, where your nervous system can finally rest because it isn't constantly patrolling for emotional security. This is the serene prize for walking away with your head held high. You required no elaborate revenge, no formal closure, and no list of answers to find peace. Your only true necessity was to retrieve your own soul, and you have reclaimed her entirely, without needing an audience or a dramatic spectacle, simply through the power of your presence. Now, silence has lost its ability to frighten you, because you recognize the treasures that live within it. Your sharp intuition, your unyielding strength, and your absolute clarity. And you trust these parts of yourself implicitly. This is the true conclusion of the narrative. It doesn't end with him, a reconciliation, or a long-winded explanation. It ends with you standing firmly and peacefully at the center of your own existence. You have finished the act of waiting and the exhaustion of wondering. You are simply moving forward, entirely whole. And that, in itself, is the most powerful silence of all. If this message resonated with your core, do not simply move on. Type silence in the comments to declare that you are prioritizing self-respect over emotional chaos. Subscribe if you have officially stopped seeking clarity from individuals who only know how to communicate through their absence. Share this with a woman who needs to be reminded of her inherent value today. Your silence is a source of power, and your presence is a sacred privilege. Never let that be forgotten.